Canada will be a police state by Christmas if Parliament passes bills C-2, C-8, and C-9 in current form, along with the reintroduction of the Online Harms Act and the prior passage of the Online Streaming Act. You get those 5 pieces of legislation together, and we're going to be locking up or arresting thousands of people, like what's happening now in the United Kingdom, where if you have a salty or vociferously worded tweet denouncing immigration policies or something politically incorrect, you can get arrested, or almost as bad, you can get a policeman knocking on your door to give you a warning.
So yeah, that seems like that's the direction that we're going, especially if there's examples of how this kind of legislation can be overused in the UK. Could you maybe break down what does each of these bills focus on, and then what's the problematic sections that we're actually concerned about?
Sure. Well, just do the tip of the iceberg. So the earlier piece passed about 2 years ago was the Online Streaming Act, and it gives the CRTC authority over the internet in Canada to dictate Canadian content, to define what Canadian content is, and to monitor and regulate every podcast, every website for Canadian content. They haven't started to exercise that power yet, but the law is in place and they can do so. So that was a problem from 2 years ago. The problem was the passage of a bad law. Again, it hasn't yet been abused as far as I know. Then we have C-2, which is the Strong Borders Act. I call it the Strong Surveillance Act. And while it does contain provisions to change our immigration and refugee policies and things pertaining to the border, it also has provisions to authorize Canada Post to search letter mail without a warrant. It bans the use of cash in amounts greater than $10,000 for donations to charity and for paying bills. It creates an Authorized Access to Information Act, which gives federal officials the power to search our computers and cell phones without a warrant. So that's really bad news. It's been denounced across the spectrum. There's so many different groups, academics, professors have denounced it, that the government's actually put it on the back burner, which is good, and it shows that activism does achieve some results. Again, just the tip of the iceberg, Bill C-8 is the Cybersecurity Act, and it empowers the federal cabinet to kick individual Canadians off the internet without warning, without due process, if the cabinet minister decides that the individual constitutes a threat to Canada's telecommunication system. Now, in theory, that should only apply to hackers and fraudsters and foreign terrorists, domestic terrorists. But there's nothing in there to prevent a cabinet minister from kicking a Canadian off the internet because he doesn't like her social media posts, podcasts, website, etc. And if you are kicked off the internet, theoretically, you can go to court, but most Canadians don't have an extra $100,000 sitting around to use for litigation, a process that's going to take 2 or 3 years, at the end of which you might not even win. So the C-8 Cybersecurity Act is very dangerous. It also gives the federal cabinet powers to search companies, to declare a company to be vital, to impose conditions on the company, to collect subscriber data and personal information about Canadians, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very broad-based, similar to the Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act, with this new Authorized Access to Information Act. It's all about warrantless searches. I can get into details on that. Bill C-9 is the Combating Hate Act, and it authorizes judges to vastly increase punishments imposed on people convicted of crimes if the judge feels that the crime was motivated by hatred. It also removes a current sober second thought process whereby when local police, local Crown prosecutors in, Edmonton, Vancouver, Ottawa, Halifax, Montreal, local Crown prosecutors have to get the permission of the Attorney General of the province, the Justice Minister, to prosecute a Canadian for hate speech. And that kind of puts the brakes on it. That's why we haven't seen too many hate speech prosecutions in Canada. There might be 2, 3, 4 per decade. Maybe there's a bunch that don't get into the news, but they're so rare that they often do hit the news. They're going to get rid of that requirement that local police and local Crown prosecutors have to get the approval of the Justice Minister. They're scrapping that. And so it gives much more leeway if a policeman feels that something is hateful. He can lay criminal charges. And even if the judge disagrees with a police officer and acquits you at the end of the day, you've now had criminal proceedings against you for the past 9 months or 18 months or 2.5 years. And so that's very menacing. If Bill C-9 passes, we're going to see a lot more Canadians, I couldn't tell you what number, being prosecuted for hate speech. And hate cannot be defined because it's an emotion. Bill C-9 tries to define hatred by saying that to ridicule someone, discredit, offend, hurt the feelings of somebody is not hate speech. Dislike and disdain are not hate speech. However, detestation and vilification are hate speech. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
You need a thesaurus to understand that.
Yeah. A good law, a just law by definition is clear. So when the criminal code says essentially thou shalt not kill, it's pretty clear. Unless you're insane, you know that you are killing somebody, intending to kill somebody. There's nothing gray about it. But how do you avoid a hate speech prosecution? And it's going to have a chilling effect whereby Canadians self-censor. Bill C-9, the Combating Hate Act, is also very political because it bans the Nazi swastika, but does not ban the communist hammer and sickle, which many people, including many immigrants to Canada, would see that as a symbol of hatred towards business owners and aristocrats and all kinds of people. But you could wave around the communist hammer and sickle, the banner under which tens of millions of people were murdered by communist regimes in Russia, China, Cambodia, etc. You can wave that around, but not the Nazi swastika. So, maybe not a big deal, but I see the politics in it. And, if we're going to start banning one hateful symbol, we should ban more of them. And then fifth, last but not least, is the Online Harms Act, which died on the order paper when we had our election in April 2025. That bill would give new powers to the Canadian Human Rights Commission to prosecute Canadians for non-criminal, offensive, or discriminatory, another vague word, discriminatory speech. And people who support that love to say, oh, it's not criminal, therefore chill, relax, it's not a big deal. But if you're found guilty by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal of discriminatory speech, you can be fined up to $50,000, plus having to pay an additional up to $20,000 to the complainant whose feelings were hurt. The Online Harms Act also empowers judges to place you under house arrest, curfew, ankle bracelet. If your neighbor fears that you might commit a hate speech crime in future, then without having been charged, without having been found guilty, you can actually have a judge restrict your freedom with house arrest or an ankle bracelet based on what you might do in future. So it's like Minority Report. It also empowers, this is the Online Streaming Act still, it empowers the federal cabinet to write all kinds of regulations governing the content of the internet without any parliamentary scrutiny. And then there'll be this brand new Digital Safety Commission, which will enforce those federal regulations. And there will be massive fines and penalties for companies that don't themselves start to remove content that they think is discriminatory. So the government can essentially get all the private companies to do their dirty work for them, because if you're a private company and you don't want to face, $1 million fines, you're going to hire your own censor to kick anybody off your social media platform or other platform. So Online Streaming Act already passed 2 years ago, C-2, C-8, C-9, and then the potential return of the Online Streaming Act. You put those 5 things together and you've got a police state.
Mm-hmm. This summer in the UK, we saw a lot of Britons being arrested and actually faced significant jail time for posts made on social media about comments related to the problem that the UK has right now with grooming gangs. Do you see this as like Canada's kind of follow-up attempt to enact similar legislation that allowed the UK to perform those acts this summer?
Sadly, yes. And to give you two examples of where Canada is at culturally, politically, legally, we've had Charlie Angus, I think he's now retired, but he was an NDP member of Parliament, put forward a proposal to make it illegal to speak positively about the oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
Now, it didn't get passed by the House of Commons and it was not adopted by the government, but the very fact that somebody would put this forward as a serious proposal. We had another NDP member of Parliament from Winnipeg said that residential school denialism, which could include saying that the residential schools experience was not necessarily bad for everybody, or challenging the unproven claim that there's 215 children buried at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So she would actually, if it was within her power, she would criminalize the opinions, the incorrect opinions about Aboriginal residential schools. David Suzuki is another example. He's not a member of Parliament, but he said that people who deny the forthcoming impending climate holocaust and who are not on board with him that we need to move ourselves into poverty by getting rid of oil and gas, that they should be jailed. They should be locked up and jailed for disagreeing with David Suzuki. So it's again, those are private members' bills, but there's a lot of Canadians that think that you should be locked up for saying the wrong thing. Just one more thing, some good news. There was so much outcry against Bill C-2, and it came from across the political spectrum and the Justice Centre and all of our supporters. There's so much outcry against Bill C-2 that the federal government still wants to push it through, but they've actually taken out the immigration and refugee and border parts of Bill C-2, put it into a separate bill, C-12, for fast tracking. And I think they're hoping to get the support of the Conservatives, and they probably will. So they're fast tracking C-12, and then that still leaves C-2 as a bad piece of legislation, but they've put it on the back burner because there's been so much opposition, and MPs of all parties have heard that, and Liberal MPs have heard from their own constituents that C-2 is bad news for freedom and for privacy. And so, yeah, contact your MP, and that's what's going to make a difference.